August 1998. The Texas heat pressed down on Waco like a weight that refused to lift. The mercury had climbed past 105 degrees for the seventh straight day, and the drought had turned the Brazos River into a thin brown ribbon threading through cracked earth. On the eastern edge of McLennan County, where cotton fields stretched toward the horizon in waves of dead stalks, a teenage couple, looking for privacy, drove their pickup down a dirt road that hadn't seen traffic in months. The road ended at an old oil derrick, abandoned since the 1970s, its rusted frame reaching toward a cloudless sky. Behind the derrick, half hidden by mesquite trees and tall grass bleached white by the sun, they found something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A child's bicycle, pink with white streamers hanging from the handlebars, leaning against a concrete irrigation pipe. The paint was faded, the chrome spotted with rust, but the name decal on the frame was still legible. Emily. 26 years would pass before anyone understood what that bicycle meant, what secrets lay buried in the hard Texas earth, and why a 8-year-old girl's disappearance had been forgotten by everyone except the sister who never stopped searching. But on November 15, 2024, a construction crew breaking ground for a new water treatment plant would strike something 4 feet below the surface that wasn't bedrock. A small skull, bleached white by decades underground, and beside it, the remnants of a purple backpack with a name tag that read, Emily Grace Morrison, age 8. Before we continue this shocking story, take a moment to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light and ensures the algorithm keeps delivering justice to families who've waited decades for answers. August 1998. The summer that would end everything began like any other in the Morrison household on Cedar Hill Drive. The subdivision was new then, carved from former farmland on the western outskirts of Waco, where tract homes with beige siding and 2-car garages promised middle-class prosperity to families fleeing the older, rougher parts of the city. The streets were wide and straight, lined with young oak trees that provided little shade, and every lawn was the same St. Augustine grass, green and perfect despite the drought, maintained by automatic sprinkler systems that ran before dawn. Emily Grace Morrison was 8 years old that summer, a small girl with shoulder-length brown hair that her mother, Linda, braided every morning before work. She had her father's green eyes and a gap between her front teeth that made her smile crooked and endearing. She was quiet in the way that thoughtful children are, preferring books to television, drawing to playing outside in the brutal heat. Her favorite subject was art, and she spent hours at the kitchen table with a box of 64 Crayola crayons, creating elaborate pictures of houses with too many windows, dogs with purple fur, and families holding hands beneath rainbow skies. Linda Morrison worked as a nurse at Providence Hospital, pulling 12-hour shifts in the cardiac unit. She was 34 years old, a single mother who'd moved to Waco 2 years earlier, after her divorce was finalized. The father, Emily's father, lived in Dallas and saw his daughter every other weekend when his work schedule allowed, which wasn't often. Linda had chosen Cedar Hill Drive specifically for its safety, for the quiet streets and good schools, for the neighbors who waved from their driveways and kept watch over each other's children. The house was small but clean, a 3-bedroom ranch with a fenced backyard where Emily could play without Linda worrying. The mortgage stretched Linda's salary thin, but it was worth it for the security, for the knowledge that Emily was growing up somewhere safe. Emily's best friend was Sarah Chen, who lived 3 houses down in an identical ranch with different colored shutters. Sarah was 9, almost a full year older, which made her seem sophisticated and worldly to Emily. They spent their summer days moving between the 2 houses, watching Disney movies in air-conditioned living rooms, playing with Barbie dolls, and when the heat became unbearable, running through the sprinklers that Sarah's father set up in the backyard. The neighborhood was full of children that summer. The Hendersons had twin boys, Jake and Josh, who were 10 and spent their days on BMX bikes performing stunts off homemade ramps. The Nguyen family had a daughter, Lisa, who was 12 and too old to play with the younger kids, but would sometimes join in games of hide-and-seek when boredom overcame adolescent dignity. At the end of the street lived Mrs. Patterson, a widow in her 70s who kept a garden despite the drought and knew every child's name, calling out warnings about playing in the street and offers of homemade cookies. It was the kind of neighborhood where parents felt comfortable letting their children roam freely, where front doors stayed unlocked, and where the greatest danger seemed to be the occasional scorpion or the possibility of heat stroke. Emily's daily routine was as predictable as the sunrise. Linda left for work at 6:30 a.m., dropping Emily at Sarah's house, where Mrs. Chen, a stay-at-home mother, watched both girls until evening. They would eat breakfast together, usually cereal and toast, then spend the morning drawing or playing quiet games inside. After lunch, if the heat wasn't too oppressive, they might venture outside to ride bikes or play in the sprinklers. By 4 p.m., they were usually back inside, watching afternoon cartoons or reading in Sarah's room, waiting for Linda to pick Emily up around 7 p.m. On weekends, the routine shifted but remained familiar. Emily would sleep late, then spend the day with Linda, running errands, going to the library, or visiting the mall where the air conditioning provided relief, and Emily could look at toys she couldn't afford but dreamed about anyway. Sunday nights were reserved for preparing for the week ahead, laying out school clothes even though it was summer, organizing Emily's art supplies, and reading together on the couch before bedtime. It was a quiet life, perhaps lonely for Linda, but stable and predictable for Emily, which was what mattered most. August 15th, 1998, started like any other Saturday. Emily woke at 8:30 a.m. and padded to the kitchen in her pink pajamas, where Linda was already dressed for a rare Saturday shift at the hospital. A colleague had called in sick, and Linda needed the overtime pay. She'd arranged for Emily to spend the day with Sarah, as usual. "Be good for Mrs. Chen," Linda said, kissing Emily's forehead as she gathered her purse and car keys. "I'll pick you up around 6. Emily nodded, still sleepy, and hugged her mother goodbye. Linda walked her down the street to the Chen house, where Mrs. Chen was waiting with breakfast and a smile. "We'll have fun today," Mrs. Chen promised. "Maybe make cookies if it's not too hot to use the oven." Linda waved goodbye and drove away, her white Honda Civic disappearing around the corner toward the main road. She didn't look back. There was no reason to. Emily would be safe with the Chens, just as she'd been dozens of times before. At the Chen house, Emily and Sarah ate breakfast and settled in front of the television to watch Saturday morning cartoons. Mrs. Chen busied herself with laundry, moving between the kitchen and the utility room. Keeping one ear on the girls but allowing them the independence they'd earned through months of good behavior. By 10:01 a.m., the temperature outside was already climbing toward triple digits, and Mrs. Chen made the decision to keep the girls inside for the day. They would bake cookies, she decided, despite the heat. At 11:30 a.m., Emily asked if she could go home to get her art supplies. She wanted to draw pictures to give to her mother when Linda picked her up, but she'd left her good crayons at home. Mrs. Chen hesitated. The walk was short, less than 2 blocks, and Emily had made it dozens of times before. The neighborhood was safe, quiet, and Emily was a responsible child who followed rules and never wandered off. "Just there and back," Mrs. Chen said. "Don't stop anywhere else, and don't talk to strangers." Emily promised, put on her sandals, and walked out the front door. Mrs. Chen watched from the window as Emily headed down the sidewalk, her small figure moving purposefully toward home. It was 11:45 a.m. Emily never arrived at her house. She never returned to the Chens. By 1 p.m., when Emily hadn't come back, Mrs. Chen was worried, but not panicked. Perhaps Emily had gotten distracted, decided to organize her art supplies, or lay down for a nap in the air conditioning. At 1:30, Mrs. Chen called the Morrison house. No answer. At 2 p.m., she walked to the house herself, Sarah trailing behind, and found the front door locked, the house empty and quiet. Emily wasn't there. She hadn't been there. Mrs. Chen's worry became fear. She knocked on neighbors' doors, asking if anyone had seen Emily. No one had. She called Linda at the hospital, but Linda was in surgery and couldn't be reached. By 3 p.m., Mrs. Chen had called the Waco Police Department. The first officer arrived at 3:20 p.m., a young patrolman named David Rodriguez, who took Mrs. Chen's statement and began a preliminary search of the neighborhood. He walked the route between the 2 houses, checking bushes, drainage ditches, and the small retention pond at the neighborhood's entrance. Other officers arrived, and the search widened. By 4 p.m., when Linda Morrison arrived home from the hospital to find police cars in her driveway, Emily had been missing for 4 hours. Chapter 2. The Search. Linda Morrison's scream when she learned Emily was missing could be heard 3 houses away. It was a sound that neighbors would describe years later as inhuman, the cry of something fundamental breaking inside a person. Officer Rodriguez, who'd delivered bad news before, had never heard anything quite like it. Linda collapsed on her front steps, her nurse's uniform wrinkled and stained with hospital disinfectant, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her house keys. Inside, Emily's bedroom looked exactly as it had that morning. The bed made, stuffed animals arranged on the pillows, the desk organized with school supplies. Linda touched everything gently, as if Emily might materialize from the careful arrangement of her possessions. By 5 p.m., the Waco Police Department had initiated a full-scale search operation. Detective Marcus Webb, a 15-year veteran with graying temples and tired eyes, was assigned as lead investigator. He'd worked dozens of missing children cases, and he knew the statistics. Most children who disappeared were found within 24 hours, usually at a friend's house or hiding somewhere obvious. But something about this case felt different. Emily Morrison wasn't the type of child who wandered off or disobeyed rules, and Cedar Hill Drive wasn't the type of place where children simply vanished. The search protocol was methodical and thorough. Officers went door to door through the entire subdivision, interviewing residents, checking backyards, pools, sheds, and any place a small child might hide or become trapped. Volunteers from the community arrived as word spread, organizing into search teams that combed the undeveloped land surrounding the neighborhood. The temperature remained above 100 degrees, making the search brutal for volunteers, but also terrifyingly urgent. If Emily was outside somewhere, she couldn't survive long in the heat without water. By evening, the search had expanded beyond Cedar Hill Drive. Officers checked local parks, shopping centers, and the Brazos River, though Emily had never shown interest in wandering that far from home. Bloodhounds were brought in from Dallas, and they picked up Emily's scent on the sidewalk between the Chen house and her home. But the trail went cold at the entrance to the subdivision, near the retention pond where the asphalt met the main road. Detective Webb interviewed Mrs. Chen for over an hour, going through every detail of Emily's last morning. When had she left? What was she wearing? Purple shorts and a yellow t-shirt with a cartoon cat on the front. Had she seemed upset or worried about anything? No. She'd been her normal, quiet self, excited about drawing pictures for her mother. Had anyone unusual been in the neighborhood recently? Mrs. Chen couldn't think of anyone. Webb spoke with Sarah Chen, though interviewing an 8-year-old required delicacy. Sarah was frightened and confused, unable to understand why her best friend had disappeared. She remembered Emily being excited about getting her art supplies, remembered watching her walk down the sidewalk, remembered that Emily had been carrying her purple backpack, the one she used for sleepovers. The backpack was missing too. As darkness fell on August 15th, the search took on a desperate quality. Portable lights were brought in, illuminating the empty fields and drainage ditches that surrounded Cedar Hill Drive like accusatory fingers. Linda Morrison walked with the search teams, calling Emily's name until her voice became hoarse, then silent. Other parents from the neighborhood joined the search, their own children safely locked inside air-conditioned houses. The illusion of suburban safety shattered. By midnight, more than 100 volunteers were involved in the search. Local television stations had picked up the story, and Emily's school photo, a smiling 8-year-old with braided hair and missing front teeth, appeared on the late news alongside pleas for information. Tips began coming in to the police department, most of them well-meaning but useless. Someone thought they'd seen a girl, matching Emily's description at a Walmart 20 miles away, but the timestamps didn't match. Another caller reported a suspicious van in the area, but couldn't provide details about the license plate or driver. At 2 a.m., Detective Webb made the decision to suspend the active search until daylight. The volunteers were exhausted. The heat was still dangerous, even at night, and searching in darkness was more likely to destroy evidence than uncover it. Linda Morrison refused to stop. She continued walking the empty streets of her neighborhood, calling Emily's name into the suffocating darkness, until Mrs. Chen and 2 police officers gently escorted her home. August 16th brought no relief from the heat and no sign of Emily Morrison. The search resumed at dawn with fresh volunteers and additional resources. The Texas Rangers sent investigators to assist, and FBI agents from the Dallas field office arrived to assess whether federal kidnapping charges might apply. The neighborhood became a carnival of law enforcement vehicles, news vans, and civilian cars as volunteers continued arriving from across McLennan County. Detective Webb expanded the investigation beyond the immediate search. Emily's father, Robert Morrison, was located in Dallas and interviewed by phone. He had a solid alibi, having been at work during Emily's disappearance, and showed genuine shock and grief when informed. The divorce had been acrimonious, but there was no history of custody disputes or threats. He drove to Waco that evening, arriving at Linda's house, where he broke down crying on the front steps. The sight of Emily's parents, embracing in grief, became the lead story on every local news station. Sex offender registries were cross-referenced with the area, and known predators were located and interviewed. 3 registered offenders lived within a 10-mile radius of Cedar Hill Drive, but all had alibis and no connection to Emily or the neighborhood. Webb's team checked with local businesses, looking for anyone who might have seen Emily walking along the main road or being approached by a stranger. The convenience store at the intersection reported nothing unusual. The gas station across from the neighborhood entrance had security cameras, but they faced the pumps, not the street. On August 17th, 72 hours after Emily's disappearance, the case officially became a kidnapping investigation. The FBI took over coordination, though Detective Webb remained involved as the local liaison. Special Agent Catherine Mills, a specialist in crimes against children, arrived from Quantico to assist with the investigation. The profile she developed was grim. Emily had most likely been abducted by someone she knew, or someone who had been watching the neighborhood, studying the routines of local families. Random abductions in broad daylight were rare, suggesting the perpetrator had planned carefully and acted quickly. The search for Emily continued for 2 weeks, but as August ended, hope began to fade. The media attention moved on to other stories. Volunteers returned to their normal lives. The FBI agents went back to Quantico, leaving behind a case file and promises to follow up on any new leads. Emily's disappearance became another statistic, another tragedy that would haunt a family and a community, but would gradually fade from public consciousness. Linda Morrison never returned to work at Providence Hospital. She couldn't concentrate on patient care when her own daughter was missing, couldn't bear the sympathetic looks from colleagues, couldn't function in a world where children could simply vanish without explanation. She quit her job and took a position at a small clinic, working part-time and spending her remaining hours searching for Emily. She printed thousands of flyers with Emily's photo and distributed them across Texas and beyond. She traveled to other states, following tips that led nowhere, spending her savings on gas and cheap motels while chasing shadows. She appeared on daytime television shows that specialized in missing children cases, her face becoming gaunt with grief and exhaustion as months passed without answers. The house on Cedar Hill Drive became a shrine to Emily's memory. Linda kept Emily's room exactly as it had been on August 15th, down to the clothes laid out for the next day, and the half-finished drawing on the desk. She refused offers from real estate agents who suggested selling and starting over somewhere else. This was where Emily lived, where Emily would expect to find her when she came home. And Linda never stopped believing Emily would come home. Detective Webb retired in 2005, 7 years after Emily's disappearance. On his last day, he pulled Emily's case file and read through it one more time, looking for something he might have missed, some detail that could breathe life back into a cold investigation. He found nothing new, but he made a promise to Linda Morrison that he would call her if anything ever developed. He kept that promise, checking in every few months, even after his retirement, though he never had good news to share. In 2010, 12 years after Emily's disappearance, Linda Morrison was diagnosed with breast cancer. The treatment was successful, but it left her weaker, more fragile. Her sister, Patricia, moved from Houston to help care for her, and for the first time since Emily's disappearance, Linda had someone who understood her refusal to give up hope. Patricia had never married, had no children of her own, and devoted herself to Linda's care and to continuing the search for Emily. She learned to navigate missing children databases, to file annual reports with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and to maintain the Facebook page that Linda had created to keep Emily's case in the public eye. By 2015, Emily's case was ancient history to everyone except Linda and Patricia Morrison. The Waco Police Department had been reorganized twice, and many of the officers who'd worked the original investigation had retired or transferred. The case file was stored in a climate-controlled warehouse, along with thousands of others, emerging only when someone specifically requested it, or when the annual cold case review brought it briefly back to light. New houses had been built in the undeveloped areas surrounding Cedar Hill Drive, and most of the neighbors from 1998 had moved away. The Chen family relocated to California in 2003, unable to bear living in the place where they'd lost Emily. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman, who'd known every child's name, died in 2008, taking with her any memories that might have held clues. The neighborhood's institutional memory of Emily Morrison faded, replaced by new families with new children who played in the same streets where Emily had once ridden her bicycle. Linda Morrison turned 60 in 2024, her brown hair now silver, her face lined with decades of grief and hope. She still lived in the house on Cedar Hill Drive, still kept Emily's room unchanged, still believed that someday, somehow, her daughter would come home. She'd survived cancer twice, a heart attack in 2019, and the deaths of both her parents. But she refused to die before learning what had happened to Emily. On quiet evenings, she would sit in Emily's room and talk to her daughter as if Emily could hear her, telling her about her day, about the weather, about how much she missed her. The room smelled like dust and old fabric now, but Linda could still detect traces of the strawberry shampoo Emily had used. The scent memory preserved in clothes that would never be worn again. November 15th, 2024. The morning that would finally bring answers to Linda Morrison began with a phone call at 6:47 a.m. Detective Sarah Cross of the McLennan County Sheriff's Department was calling about a discovery at a construction site on the eastern edge of Waco. Human remains had been found during excavation for a new water treatment plant, and preliminary examination suggested they belonged to a child. Linda's hands shook as she held the phone. 26 years of hoping and dreading this exact call had not prepared her for the reality of it. Detective Cross's voice was gentle but professional, explaining that identification would take time, that dental records would need to be compared, that Linda should not assume anything until forensic analysis was complete. But Linda knew, in the deepest part of her heart, she knew that Emily had finally been found. Chapter 3. The Discovery. The construction site where Emily Morrison's remains were discovered sat on land that had been farmland in 1998, 12 miles east of Cedar Hill Drive, across a landscape that had been transformed by 26 years of suburban expansion. What had once been cotton fields and cattle pastures was now dotted with shopping centers, apartment complexes, and the infrastructure of a growing city. The site itself was unremarkable, a a flat expanse of red Texas dirt, marked by surveyors' stakes and heavy machinery, designated for a water treatment facility that would serve the county's expanding population. Tommy Vasquez, the excavator operator who made the discovery, had been digging foundation trenches since dawn. The work was routine, mechanical, the kind of job where his mind could wander while the hydraulic arms bit into the earth. At 9:20 a.m., the bucket hit something that felt wrong, not the usual resistance of clay or rock, but something that gave way with a hollow sound. Vasquez stopped the machine and climbed down to investigate. Protruding from the red dirt was what looked like a fragment of white plastic, but when he brushed away the soil, he realized it was bone. Small, delicate, unmistakably human. His hands shaking, Vasquez called his foreman, who called the sheriff's department. By 10 a.m., the construction site was cordoned off with yellow tape, and Detective Sarah Cross was standing at the edge of a shallow grave that had been hidden for more than 2 decades. The remains were those of a child, clearly visible now that more soil had been carefully removed. The skeleton was small, delicate, positioned in what appeared to be a fetal position. Scraps of fabric clung to the bones, purple and yellow, colors that could have been shorts and a t-shirt. Near the skull, partially buried in sediment, was a tattered backpack. When crime scene technicians carefully lifted it from the earth, they found a luggage tag still attached to the zipper, the laminated paper yellowed but legible. Emily Grace Morrison, 1247 Cedar Hill Drive, Waco, TX. Detective Cross had worked dozens of homicide cases, but she felt her breath catch as she read the name. She'd heard of Emily Morrison, the little girl who'd vanished in 1998, though she'd been a rookie patrol officer then and hadn't worked the case. Now, 26 years later, Emily had been found less than 30 miles from where she'd disappeared, buried in what had been an isolated field, but was now surrounded by the expansion of modern Waco. The McLennan County Medical Examiner's Office was contacted, and Dr. Angela Reyes, the chief medical examiner, arrived at the site by noon. The remains were photographed extensively before being carefully excavated, each bone cataloged and placed in specialized containers for transport to the lab. Dr. Reyes conducted a preliminary examination at the scene, noting that the skeleton appeared complete and showed no obvious signs of trauma, though detailed analysis would be required to determine cause of death. The purple backpack was opened carefully, its contents photographed before being removed. Inside, they found the remains of school supplies, pencils reduced to fragments, a notebook with pages stuck together by decades of moisture. But, in a side pocket, wrapped in what had once been a plastic bag, they found Emily's artwork. 26 years underground had damaged the paper, but the images were still visible. Crayon drawings of houses with too many windows, stick figure families, and horses running across fields of green grass. The artwork was preserved exactly as Emily had left it, a time capsule of an 8-year-old's imagination frozen in time. Detective Cross contacted Linda Morrison that evening, driving to the house on Cedar Hill Drive, to deliver the news in person. Linda answered the door, wearing a nightgown and robe, her silver hair uncombed, her face marked by the exhaustion of someone who'd been waiting for bad news for 26 years. When Cross identified herself and asked to come inside, Linda's legs gave out, and she had to grip the doorframe to remain standing. They sat in Emily's unchanged bedroom, surrounded by stuffed animals and childhood drawings, while Cross explained what had been found. Linda listened in silence, her hands folded in her lap, tears streaming down her face. When Cross finished talking, Linda spoke in a whisper. Did someone hurt her? Cross explained that the investigation was just beginning, that determining cause of death would take time, but that there were no obvious signs of violence. The location of the grave, however, suggested that Emily hadn't died accidentally. Someone had buried her deliberately, far from where she disappeared, in a place where she might never have been found. Who would do this? Linda asked, her voice breaking. Who would hurt a little girl? Cross didn't have an answer. Not yet. But as she drove home that night, she made a mental promise to Linda Morrison and to Emily. After 26 years of silence, the truth was finally going to come out. The forensic analysis of Emily Morrison's remains took 3 weeks and confirmed what Linda had known in her heart. Dental records provided positive identification. The child found at the construction site was Emily Grace Morrison, who'd been 8 years old when she disappeared on August 15, 1998. Dr. Reyes's autopsy revealed no obvious cause of death, which in cases involving skeletal remains often indicated suffocation or poisoning, causes that left no marks on bone. What the autopsy did reveal was disturbing in its implications. Emily's remains had been carefully positioned in the grave, not dumped or hastily buried. She'd been wrapped in a blanket that had long since decomposed, leaving only fabric fibers clinging to the bones. Her backpack had been placed beside her, suggesting someone who cared enough to include her possessions in the grave, yet had killed her nonetheless. The location itself provided crucial information. Soil analysis revealed that the grave had been dug sometime in late summer or early fall of 1998, consistent with Emily's disappearance timeline. But the site was 12 miles from Cedar Hill Drive, across terrain that an 8-year-old could never have covered on foot. Whoever had taken Emily had transported her to this remote location, killed her, and buried her where she wouldn't be found for decades. Detective Cross assembled a task force to reinvestigate Emily's disappearance using modern forensic techniques and fresh eyes. The 1998 case file was digitized and analyzed, every interview re-examined, every piece of evidence reconsidered. What emerged was a picture of an investigation that had been thorough for its time, but limited by the technology and resources available in the late 1990s. The original investigators had focused primarily on stranger abduction scenarios, interviewing registered sex offenders and looking for someone who'd targeted Emily randomly. But the careful burial of Emily's remains suggested a different type of perpetrator, someone who knew Emily personally, someone who felt enough connection to her to treat her body with a twisted form of respect. Cross began re-interviewing people who'd been connected to Emily's case in 1998. Many had died or moved away, but those who remained provided new perspectives, shaped by 26 years of hindsight. Mrs. Chen, now living in California, spoke by video conference about her guilt over letting Emily walk home alone that day. Sarah Chen, now 34 and a mother herself, broke down crying as she remembered her best friend's disappearance. The investigation's breakthrough came from an unexpected source: construction records from 1998. Cross discovered that the area where Emily's body was found had been the site of a small construction project that summer, a utility easement being installed for future development. The contractor who'd worked the site was listed in county records as Morrison Construction, owned by a man named James Morrison. The name set off immediate alarm bells. Cross ran a background check and discovered that James Morrison was Robert Morrison's older brother, Emily's uncle. He'd never been interviewed during the original investigation because family members hadn't mentioned his existence, and he'd been living in Oklahoma in 1998. But employment records showed he'd been working in the Waco area that summer, supervising the utility project near where Emily's body was found. James Morrison was 68 years old in 2024, retired and living in a small town outside Oklahoma City. When Cross and two FBI agents arrived at his house on December 3, 2024, he answered the door calmly, as if he'd been expecting them. He was a large man with gray hair and calloused hands, wearing work clothes despite his retirement. His eyes were the same green as Emily's had been. "You found her," he said simply when Cross identified herself. It wasn't a question. Cross nodded. "We need to talk, Mr. Morrison." James invited them inside, offered coffee, and sat in his living room surrounded by photos of the family he'd built after 1998. A wife, now deceased, two grown children who lived in other states, grandchildren who visited on holidays. The walls were covered with evidence of a life well lived, achievements, and celebrations that had continued while Emily lay buried in the Texas dirt. "I've been waiting for this day for 26 years, James said when Cross began her questions. "Part of me hoped you'd never find her. Part of me hoped you would." The confession that followed was delivered in a flat, emotionless voice that made the horror of it even more chilling. James Morrison had been working the construction site near Waco in August 1998, staying in a cheap motel and driving to his brother's neighborhood on weekends. He'd met Emily during one of these visits, had offered to give her art lessons, had gained her trust over several weeks. On August 15th, when he saw Emily walking alone on Cedar Hill Drive, he'd offered her a ride home. She'd accepted because she knew him, because he was her uncle, because she'd been taught to trust family. Instead of taking her home, James had driven Emily to his motel room, where he'd sexually assaulted her. When Emily threatened to tell her mother what had happened, James had panicked. He couldn't let her speak, couldn't let his family discover what he'd done, couldn't face the consequences of his actions. He'd suffocated Emily with a pillow, then wrapped her body in a motel blanket and transported her to the construction site where he'd been working. The grave had been dug with equipment he had access to, Emily's body buried beneath soil that would remain undisturbed for decades. James had finished the construction project, returned to Oklahoma, and never spoken of Emily again. He'd built a life, raised a family, and attended Christmas dinners, where Emily's empty chair went unmentioned, where Linda's grief was respected but not discussed. For 26 years, he'd carried the secret of what he'd done, watching his brother Robert struggle with guilt and Linda Morrison waste away with sorrow, never saying a word. "Why?" Cross asked when the confession was complete. "Why did you let them suffer for so long?" James Morrison looked at his hands, calloused from decades of honest work that had followed one moment of unforgivable evil. "Because I was a coward," he said. "Because once you let people suffer for a day, it becomes easier to let them suffer for a year. And once you let them suffer for a year, it becomes easier to let them suffer forever." He was arrested without resistance, charged with capital murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault of a child. The case made national headlines. Uncle arrested in 26-year-old cold case murder. Photos of Emily, as a smiling 8-year-old, appeared alongside mugshots of James Morrison, the family resemblance unmistakable and disturbing. Linda Morrison learned of the arrest from Detective Cross, who again drove to Cedar Hill Drive to deliver the news in person. Linda listened in silence, sitting in Emily's unchanged bedroom, as Cross explained how her daughter had died and who had killed her. When the explanation was complete, Linda asked only one question. Did she suffer? Cross hesitated before answering. The medical examiner believes it was quick. Linda nodded, then began to cry. Not the desperate sobs that had marked the early years of her grief, but quiet tears of exhaustion and relief. After 26 years of not knowing, the truth was somehow easier to bear than the uncertainty had been. The trial of James Morrison began on March 15, 2025. He pled guilty to all charges, sparing Linda Morrison the trauma of a lengthy court proceeding. In his statement to the court, James expressed remorse for his actions, but offered no excuse for the decades of silence that had followed. The judge, noting the particularly heinous nature of the crime and the suffering inflicted on Emily's family, sentenced James Morrison to death. He was 68 years old and would likely die of natural causes before the sentence could be carried out. But the symbolism mattered to Linda Morrison and to the community that had never forgotten Emily. As James Morrison was led away in chains, Linda Morrison sat in the courtroom's front row holding a photo of Emily taken on her 8th birthday. The little girl in the photo was smiling, gap-toothed and innocent, unaware of what would happen 3 months later. Linda had carried that photo every day for 26 years, and she would carry it until the day she died. Chapter 4. Justice and Memory. The house on Cedar Hill Drive had been Linda Morrison's shrine to Emily's memory for 26 years. But after James Morrison's conviction, it became something different. A place where grief could finally transform into something resembling peace. Linda was 60 years old now, her hair silver, her hands marked by arthritis. But for the first time since 1998, she could sleep through the night without waking in panic, wondering where Emily was. The community's reaction to James Morrison's arrest and conviction was a mixture of relief, horror, and guilt. For 26 years, Waco had lived with the unresolved mystery of Emily Morrison's disappearance, a shadow that hung over every parent's sense of safety. The revelation that Emily had been killed by her own uncle, a man who'd been welcomed into family gatherings and trusted with children, shattered assumptions about how evil operated in the world. Many of Emily's neighbors from 1998 had moved away, but those who remained struggled with questions that had no satisfying answers. Why hadn't anyone noticed James Morrison's interest in Emily? Why hadn't the original investigation uncovered his presence in Waco that summer? How many family gatherings had he attended, while Emily's body lay buried in the Texas dirt? Mrs. Chen, now living in California, issued a statement through her daughter saying she'd forgiven herself for letting Emily walk home alone that day. Sarah Chen, Emily's childhood best friend, established a foundation in Emily's memory to support families of missing children. The foundation's mission was simple: to ensure that no family would wait 26 years for answers, that every missing child case would receive the resources and attention it deserved. Detective Sarah Cross was promoted to lieutenant following her work on Emily's case, but she found little satisfaction in the advancement. The successful resolution of a cold case was supposed to be a career highlight. But the reality of Emily's murder, the decades of suffering it had caused, and the knowledge that other cases remained unsolved, left Cross with a sense of responsibility that extended far beyond professional duty. She began specializing in cold cases, particularly those involving missing children, driven by the understanding that every unresolved case represented a family trapped in the limbo that Linda Morrison had endured. Linda Morrison's life, after the trial, was both an ending and a beginning. For the first time in 26 years, she could make plans that extended beyond searching for Emily, could imagine a future that wasn't defined entirely by loss. She sold the house on Cedar Hill Drive in July 2025, donating Emily's clothes and toys to a local children's charity, but keeping the artwork, the photos, and the memories that mattered most. She moved to a small apartment near downtown Waco, close enough to visit Emily's grave, but far enough from Cedar Hill Drive to begin healing. Emily Grace Morrison was buried in Waco Memorial Cemetery on a hillside overlooking the Brazos River. Linda had chosen the spot carefully. It was peaceful, shaded by old oak trees, and faced east toward the sunrise. The headstone was simple black granite with Emily's name, dates, and the inscription that read, "Beloved daughter, forever 8, forever remembered." Below the text was an engraved image of a little girl with braided hair, smiling the gap-toothed smile that had been Emily's signature. The grave became a pilgrimage site for people who'd followed Emily's case, who'd been touched by Linda's 26-year search, or who simply needed to pay respects to a child whose life had been cut short by unthinkable evil. Visitors left flowers, toys, and notes, creating a constantly changing memorial that reflected a community's need to acknowledge what had been lost and what had been found. Linda visited the grave every Sunday, bringing fresh flowers and sitting quietly in the shade, talking to Emily about her week, about the weather, about memories they'd shared during Emily's 8 years of life. These conversations were different from the ones she'd held in Emily's bedroom for 26 years. Where those had been desperate attempts to maintain connection across an unknowable void, these were peaceful exchanges between a mother and daughter who were finally, in some sense, together again. On the first anniversary of Emily's discovery, November 15, 2025, Linda Morrison stood at her daughter's grave, surrounded by dozens of people who'd gathered to remember Emily and to honor Linda's persistence in searching for the truth. Detective Cross spoke about the importance of never giving up on missing children cases. Sarah Chen read a poem she'd written about childhood friendship and loss. A local minister offered prayers for Emily's soul and for the healing of those who loved her. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, Linda remained alone at Emily's grave, holding the same birthday photo she'd carried for 26 years. The little girl in the photo would have been 34 years old now, possibly married, possibly a mother herself. Linda allowed herself to imagine the life Emily might have lived, the woman she might have become, the grandchildren who would never exist. But these weren't the desperate fantasies that had sustained her during the dark years of not knowing. They were gentle remembrances, ways of honoring Emily's potential while accepting the reality of her loss. James Morrison died in prison on February 3, 2026, 18 months after his conviction. He was 70 years old, and the official cause of death was listed as complications from diabetes, though some who knew the case suspected he'd simply lost the will to continue living with the weight of what he'd done. Linda Morrison felt no satisfaction in his death, no sense of justice finally being served. Emily was still gone, and James Morrison's death couldn't change that fundamental reality. If anything, Linda felt a strange sort of pity for a man who'd destroyed so many lives, including his own, through a moment of weakness that had defined his entire existence. The case of Emily Grace Morrison became a textbook study in cold case investigation, taught in police academies and forensic programs across the country. The combination of new technology, fresh perspective, and persistent investigation that had finally solved the case became a model for how law enforcement agencies could approach decades-old mysteries. Detective Cross was frequently invited to speak at conferences about cold case methodology, and she always began her presentations with Emily's photo, reminding audiences that behind every case file was a real child, a real family, and real suffering that extended far beyond statistical summaries. The construction site where Emily's body had been found was completed in 2026, becoming the Brazos Valley Water Treatment Facility. A small memorial garden was created near the entrance, featuring a bronze plaque that read, "In memory of Emily Grace Morrison, and all children whose voices were silenced too soon. May their memory inspire us to protect the innocent and seek justice for the lost." The garden contained native Texas wildflowers that bloomed each spring, creating a splash of color in the industrial landscape. Linda Morrison retired fully in 2027 at age 63 and devoted herself to volunteer work with the Sarah Chen Foundation. She counseled other families of missing children, offering the hard-won wisdom that comes from navigating decades of uncertainty and the eventual resolution that some families would never experience. Her message to these families was both honest and hopeful. The not knowing was its own form of hell, but it was possible to build a meaningful life even while carrying that burden. Some cases would be solved, others wouldn't, but giving up hope was not the same as giving up life. Every March 12th, the anniversary of Emily's disappearance, Linda Morrison participated in the National Missing Children's Day observance, reading Emily's name from a podium alongside hundreds of others. The ritual was both heartbreaking and healing, a reminder that Emily's story was part of a much larger tragedy, but also part of an ongoing effort to prevent such tragedies from occurring. Linda's voice was strong when she spoke Emily's name, no longer broken by grief, but refined by it, tempered into something that could honor her daughter's memory while acknowledging the reality of loss. As Linda Morrison approached her 70th birthday in 2034, 10 years after Emily's discovery, she reflected on the strange trajectory of her life. She'd spent 26 years searching for her daughter, and another decade learning to live with the answers she'd found. The woman who'd collapsed on her front steps in 1998, destroyed by Emily's disappearance, had evolved into someone who could speak publicly about grief and healing, who could offer comfort to other parents facing similar losses, and who could remember Emily not just as a victim, but as a child who'd been loved completely during her 8 years of life. The house on Cedar Hill Drive had been demolished in 2028, replaced by a small park that featured playground equipment and benches where parents could watch their children play safely. Linda visited the park occasionally, sitting on a bench that faced the spot where Emily's bedroom window had once been, remembering the life they'd shared in that house and the years of waiting that had followed. The neighborhood around the park had changed completely since 1998, filled with new families who knew nothing of Emily Morrison or the tragedy that had once defined the area. This forgetting was both painful and necessary, Linda realized. Emily's story would be remembered by those who needed to remember it, but life had to continue for everyone else. Children needed safe places to play, and parents needed neighborhoods where they could believe, however tentatively, in their children's safety. On quiet Sunday afternoons, Linda Morrison would sit by Emily's grave and marvel at the strange arithmetic of loss and recovery. 26 years of not knowing, followed by 10 years of painful knowledge, and now the beginning of something she could only call peace. Emily would always be 8 years old in Linda's memory, gap-toothed and artistic, excited about drawing pictures and riding her bicycle. But Linda was no longer frozen in 1998, no longer trapped in the desperate hope that her daughter might still be alive somewhere. She'd learned to carry Emily's memory forward into a future that included new relationships, new purposes, and a hard-earned understanding of how love persists even after loss becomes final. The last entry in Detective Sarah Cross's case file on Emily Grace Morrison was dated August 15, 2034, exactly 36 years after Emily's disappearance. The entry was brief. Case officially closed. Victim's remains identified and returned to family. Perpetrator deceased. Family continuing to heal. Justice served, though incomplete. Emily Grace Morrison remembered. Cross had been promoted to captain by then, overseeing the cold case division she'd helped establish in McLennan County. Emily's case had been the foundation of a program that had solved dozens of other cold cases, bringing closure to families who'd waited years or decades for answers. The program's motto, suggested by Linda Morrison herself, was simple. Every child matters. Every case matters. Every family deserves the truth. In 2035, Linda Morrison was invited to speak at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's annual conference. She was 71 years old by then, her silver hair styled neatly, her voice clear and strong as she addressed an audience of law enforcement officers, victim advocates, and other family members. She spoke about the importance of never giving up on cold cases, about the need to support families during the terrible waiting periods that characterized missing children investigations, and about the possibility of healing even after the worst imaginable loss. As she concluded her remarks, Linda Morrison held up a photo of Emily, the same birthday picture she'd carried for 37 years. The little girl in the photo was still 8 years old, still smiling, still frozen in a moment of pure childhood joy that no amount of subsequent tragedy could diminish. "This is my daughter, Emily Grace Morrison," Linda said to the audience. "She was taken from me when she was 8 years old, and I spent 26 years searching for her. When we finally found her, the truth was more painful than I'd imagined. But it was still the truth. And the truth set me free to remember her life, instead of being trapped by her death." She paused, looking at Emily's photo once more. Every child in every case file is someone's Emily. They all deserve to be found. They all deserve to be remembered. And their families all deserve the truth, however painful it might be. Because the truth, even when it breaks your heart, is the only thing that can eventually heal it. The audience rose in sustained applause, not for Linda Morrison's words alone, but for her persistence, her grace, and her transformation of unimaginable loss into a force for helping others. Linda Morrison returned to Waco that evening and drove directly to the cemetery, where she sat beside Emily's grave as the sun set over the Texas landscape. The oak trees that shaded Emily's resting place had grown taller in the years since the burial, their branches providing more shelter, their roots growing deeper into the earth that held Emily's remains. Linda placed fresh flowers on the grave, yellow daisies that had been Emily's favorite, and spoke quietly to her daughter about the day, about the people she'd met, about the families who were still searching for their own missing children. As darkness fell over Waco, Linda Morrison prepared to leave the cemetery, but she wasn't departing in the desperate, incomplete way she'd left so many other places during the 26 years of searching. She was leaving in peace, knowing that Emily was finally home, knowing that the truth had been told, and knowing that their story, as painful as it had been, might help other families find their own paths through the darkness of loss toward whatever light might await them on the other side.